good morning. Welcome to Creek's End today. What a great song for today, right? Oh, God, give us rest. We've lost an hour of sleep. Help us. I understand that they're trying to get us to be able to vote on this. I'm just curious, how many would vote to do away with it? I thought. Okay, well, let's start. Let's get ready, right? Let's go vote. I'm ready. I am ready. Welcome to our second week of our series, Gearing Down. If you're watching online or our live stream, welcome to you as well. I know it's spring break week. We'll probably have a lot of people enjoying that, getting some rest. At least the students are. I don't think the parents are. But if you missed last week, we kind of set the tone for the entire series. And here's what we said. We said that rest is an activity that must be planned for and then pursued. Planned for and then pursued. And we talked about how God created the world. He worked for 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. He blessed the seventh day. He didn't bless any of the other days. He blessed the seventh day. And he wanted us to make it holy, to get some rest, to pause and catch our breath. And it's important. God created us. He knew what we needed. He created work, but he also created rest. And when we gear down, as God wants us to do from time to time, we get rest from the work, which we need. We get refreshment for our walk. We catch our breath so we can carry on. And then it revives our worship because we have carried those Sabbath principles from Judaism on Saturday to the Lord's Day on Sunday, which is the first day of the week. Saturday is the Sabbath, and it's the weekend. Today is the first day of the week. It's not the weekend. And we said that 24/7 is not in God's vocabulary. It's our culture, but God says we need to take some time to rest. So we're going to build on that a little bit more today as we talk about being frazzled. Now, what does the word frazzled mean? Look it up in the dictionary, and here's what you get. Extremely tired in a nervous or slightly worried way after a lot of mental or physical effort. Now, how many of you that just describes where you're at right now? Okay, hands up. I know it. We're there. You know, I know that a lot of us are at that point where another word is stressed, where we're just stressed out. We're frazzled. We're on the edge. And I've been there many times in my life. One of the most recent times was actually about 5 years ago in 2014. The very first week of 2014, my son was getting married. And we were preparing for a wedding early January. We had just gotten through the holidays. You know how stressful that is, right? Dealing with family, dealing with all that. And then at that point in my life, I had been taking care of my parents for 2 years. And they weren't doing that well. And my dad, who was on dialysis, had to be taken 3 days a week to get dialysis. And I took him, and then I had to go back and get him. So I did that for 2 years. And things were beginning to kind of crash in on me because I have 3 siblings, and I wasn't getting any help from my siblings with my parents. And so I was letting that kind of build up inside. So anyway, all of this built up, and the evening, probably 3 or 4 nights before the wedding, my sister was in town, and of course we were all gathered around the table, and we were talking about an issue, and I really can't tell you what we were talking about that upset me. But it did upset me. And our voices began to rise. And then I came to a boiling point. You know what a boiling point is, right? I was sitting at the island bar in the kitchen. Everybody else was sitting around the table or standing around. I was sitting on a bar stool, and there was an empty bar stool by me. And I lost it. And I kicked that other bar stool all the way across the kitchen where people had to scatter to keep from getting hit by it. And it was a metal bar stool. And I just kicked it across the room, and I just had enough. And I bet you've been there. And yes, your pastor can have an edge. All right? It takes me a while to get there, but I can get there. And I was there. I was frazzled. And I remember, I was sorry for what I did, but I just had to leave the room. I got up and I left the room, and I cooled off, and everything, worked itself out. But I know that you can relate to that. And the reason I know that you can relate to that is what the statistics tell me. Because I know that 30% of you right now in this room, 3 out of every 10 of you, are dealing with extreme stress. And there are 43% of you who are already suffering the adverse health effects from that. And 48% of you your stress has increased in the last 5 years for whatever reason. So I want to talk about that today because part of gearing down is getting some rest. You can't eliminate stress. You never will eliminate it. You have to learn how to deal with it. And here's what we're going to talk about today. Rest helps us deal with our stress. Rest helps us deal with our stress. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19 today in the Old Testament. If you have a Bible, turn there. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in front of you. And, of course, we'll have the verses on the screen as well. 1 Kings 19, and we're going to talk about Elijah, another prophet, man of God, holy man of God, who got frazzled. Happens to us all, to the best of us. But let me kind of set some context for you. We're going to be in chapter 19, but I have to take you to chapter 18 first because something happened in chapter 18. Those of you who have raised in church, and we've even talked about this passage before in another series, but Elijah had just had what I call a smackdown with the prophets of Baal. King Ahab, the king of Israel, had married a foreigner, a pagan foreigner named Jezebel. Jezebel had brought her false gods into Israel, and they were trying to force people to worship the god of Baal and the god of Asherah. So God had enough of that. He told Elijah, I want you to deal with it. Elijah got all these prophets of Baal. There were over 400 of them together on Mount Carmel. And if you're familiar with the story, if you're not, you should read it. I don't have time to read it today. But anyway, they gathered around, and Elijah had all these prophets call on their God to bring down fire on a sacrifice. And they cried out and prayed all day, and their God, of course, didn't answer because they have false gods. Well, then Elijah's turn comes, and Elijah asks God to rain down fire on this sacrifice, and sure enough, God rains down, eats up that sacrifice, eats up the other guy's sacrifice, and by the time it's all over, 400 prophets of Baal are killed and executed. So it was a great victory for God and for Elijah that day. But then something happened. And the one we look at in chapter 19, that Elijah is totally different from the one I just told you about in chapter 18. So what I want to do is I want to read through it, kind of give you the context of it as we read through it, and then we're going to go back and talk about how do you deal with being frazzled, okay? 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. So Jezebel's a little angry. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. And while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush. He sat under it, and look at this. He prayed that he might die. You ever been there? I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And all at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. And strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Now, that's all we have time to read, but as you can see, that's a totally different Elijah than the one I mentioned in chapter 18, who was up on the mountaintop on a high after what God had done. God displayed his glory and power. But that little smackdown on Mount Carmel had cost him a lot emotionally and physically. And it was about all he'd take. And then to have his life threatened by the queen, so he runs. And we can relate to Elijah because we've been there. We've been up here, and then suddenly things go down here. And if he would have just taken some time to gear down, all the symptoms were there of being stressed out and frazzled. But God knew it, and God, I think, dealt with this. So I want us to look at some things. In verse 4, for instance, it says, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came to that broom bush. He sat down under it, prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord." He said, "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Let me tell you something about stress. And if you're taking notes, write this down. Stress causes us to question our worth. When we get frazzled, when we get on the edge, we start to put ourselves down. There's this little tape that goes on in our mind that I'm a nobody. My life evidently doesn't matter. I'm insignificant. I don't count. I have no value. That kind of keeps going on in our mind because of where we are with our circumstances. And what Elijah does is he starts comparing himself to his ancestors. He says, "I'm no better than those guys." And when you start comparing yourself to someone else, you're going to be frazzled. When you start comparing your problems and your trials with other people who don't have problems and trials, you're going to get frazzled. When you start comparing your social status, your financial status, your job status with someone else, you're going to start to feel frazzled and start to question your worth. And the worst thing you can do is you start comparing your expectations with reality, and you just get on edge. Life didn't turn out like you thought it was. You get all frazzled. That's when you need to understand it's time to gear down. Skip down to verse 9. We find Elijah in a cave. There he went into a cave, spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars and put your prophets to death with the sword." Now understand, here's Elijah, a man of God, a teacher of truth, and he's blaming himself for things that weren't his fault. All his job was to tell people what God wanted them to hear. That was his job. He was a prophet. He said, "This is what God says," and deliver the message. But he gets all frazzled because these people don't seem to be responding. He says they've torn down your altars. They've rejected your covenant. They've put your prophets to death with the sword. So these guys, they had been into all kinds of paganism because of Jezebel. And he's teaching and preaching, and they're just not changing, and he blames himself. And we do the same thing. When we get all stressed out, we start to devalue our work. That's what Elijah was doing. All this work that he had done, he was beginning to devalue it. And I know that feeling. I've been there times when I've got, I've know God's given me something to say on a Sunday, and I know that when I say it, I know God wanted me to say it, but I also know that 80 to 90% of the people aren't going to get it, aren't going to do anything about it. But I learned a long time ago that I'm not responsible for your response. I'm only responsible for delivering the message. But Elijah thought he was responsible. So stress causes us to devalue our work. And basically what he was trying to do, Elijah was just trying to control everything. He's thinking, you know what? If it's to be, it's up to me. I've just got to make this happen. It's all my fault, and I've got to make this happen. And God never meant for Elijah or anyone else to be the general manager of the universe. And yet he blamed himself, and he devalues all the work that he had done up to that point. And what an incredible thing he'd done just in chapter 18. All of a sudden means nothing. Let me show you something else in that last part of verse 10. He says, I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. You hear that pity party going on there? God, I'm the only person in the whole world who lives for you and loves you, and they're trying to kill me too. Stress causes us to exaggerate our problems. We overemphasize what's wrong, and we kind of ignore God's blessings in our lives. We focus on the negative rather than the positive. I mean, just a few days earlier, this great miracle had taken place. Elijah prayed, the fire came down from heaven, huge miracle. And the whole nation, it says, turned to God. In one day, the whole nation's turned to God. And here he says, I'm the only one left. And they're trying to kill me too. He's so drained emotionally, spiritually, physically, he can't even focus on reality. He can't get the picture right. Have you ever been that tired and exhausted and stressed? Where you can't even see reality, you can't think straight, you can't see what's really happening and that everybody else is trying to get to you? That's the way Elijah felt. But what he forgot was that a few days earlier, that whole nation had turned to God. But even before that, and we read this later on in this chapter, God told him, Elijah, before you even had that smackdown on Mount Carmel, there were 7,000 people who never bowed their knee to Asherah or Baal. There were already 7,000 people who were loyal to me before you even did all that. You're not the only one. And he's exaggerating things. And he says on top of that, he says, they're trying to kill me. It sounds like the whole world is after him. It wasn't the whole world. It was just one woman. I realize, men, that sometimes one woman feels like the whole world, but Jezebel was after him. And on top of that, she wasn't really intending to kill him. If you're intending to kill a person, you don't send a messenger to tell him you're going to kill him. You just send a hitman. Now, I'm not speaking from experience, but I'm pretty sure that's how it goes. If you're going to kill somebody, you just kill them. You don't tell them you're going to kill them. See what she wasn't intended on. She was as scared of him as he was of her. But I think when you get to that frazzled stage, you listen to your feelings rather than the facts. And you focus on how you feel rather than on what is real, what's the truth. And have you not learned yet that feelings lie? Emotions lie. Just because you feel something doesn't mean it's the truth. Elijah needed to gear down. And I don't think Elijah realized it, but all along, God was trying to tell him how to do that. You look at verse 5. He says, he lay down under the bush, he fell asleep, and all at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. And he ate and drank, and then he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. And strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, I love this about God. When Elijah was frazzled, God didn't give him a lecture. God didn't reprimand him. God didn't say, come on, Elijah, remember what happened just a few days ago? Come on, man. He didn't preach at him. He didn't yell at him. He first tells him, sleep and eat. Elijah, you need to get some rest. You need to rest. And God begins to reveal to Elijah how you gear down when you're at this frazzled stage. So let me share with you what he did with Elijah. First of all, to gear down, we have to address the physical. You have to address the physical. God understands your body better than you do. And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is sleep. Just sleep. Get some rest. Vince Lombardi, you know, that famous coach of the Green Bay Packers, used to say, fatigue makes cowards of us all. And it's true. When you're worn out, when you're beat, you can't handle the stresses and pressures that normally wouldn't bother you. And sometimes one good night's rest can change your perspective overnight. You need to eat right. Research tells us, and it's very obvious, certain foods have certain effects on our bodies. So we need proper rest and we need proper nutrition. God made your body to work in harmony with food. And when you get out of balance, it affects your mood. And you fall into those first three things we talked about earlier. So we have to address the physical. We have to get rest and proper nutrition. Now look at the last part of verse 13. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Now, this is the second time he said this. What's he doing? He's releasing his frustrations. And that's the emotional part. We have to address the emotional to gear down. And sometimes, the way I look at it, sometimes when I want to reveal my frustrations to God, I kind of picture a chair and a couch. And God's in the chair and I'm on the couch. And I'm just letting it out. And I've done that from time to time. Just release the feelings. That's the emotional part of it. And that's what Elijah's doing. God, I feel afraid. I feel lonely. I feel depressed. I feel worried. I feel angry. And guess what? God wasn't shocked. But again, he didn't reprimand him. He just listened. He just listened. And he knows how we're wired. I want to help you out. And the next thing he does is show him what he can do next. But we have to get to that point where we have to release our feelings. We release it to God. Maybe you need to release it to your spouse or a friend that's close that doesn't judge you, or maybe a pastor. But it's okay to release those feelings and tell God what you're feeling. Elijah did. That's the emotional part of it. But look at one more thing in verse 11. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then after the fire came a gentle whisper. Now, why did God do this? First, he gives him this spectacular hurricane kind of wind. Then he gives him an earthquake. Then he gives him a firestorm. But then he speaks in a gentle whisper. What's God doing? Two things. First, in order to hear a gentle whisper, what do you have to do? Well, you pretty much have to stop what you're doing and listen, right? You got to be very quiet to hear a gentle whisper. Second, he's reminding Elijah of his power. I'm in control. I'm sovereign. You think things are bad, but my power is greater. I know how you feel. Elijah, thank you for sharing that with me. Now let me just show you something. Stop and listen, and then see how powerful I am. I'm still in control. You can still trust me. You don't have to face this alone. And so God shows Elijah what to do when you're all frazzled. You got to gear down. You gear down and you address the physical. You gear down and you address the emotional. You gear down and you address the spiritual. Why? Because the root of all stress, and because the root of all frazzlement, if that's a word, is you and me trying to play God. we're trying to take it all. We're trying to do it all. We're trying to be the manager of the universe. And that's the root of all stress. We have to be in charge. And God never meant it to be that way. He wants to be the manager of your life. He created you. He knows how your body ticks. He knows how your mind ticks. And He wants to work in harmony with you to fulfill the plan and purpose that you were created for. So, God created rest to help us deal with our stress. And that's why it's so important for us to gear down. And when you find yourself doing those things that we talked about, questioning our worth, devaluing our work, exaggerating our problems, those are signs that we're there at the edge and we better address some things. One of the things that some people find helpful are these. You know what this is? It's a big yellow ball. It's a stress ball. That's what that is, right? Now, just how many of you think that you're really, really stressed right now? Don't be afraid to raise your hand. It's okay, because we're right there with you, okay? All right. Anybody in that section over there feel really stressed? Anybody? Here you go, Mike. How about this section? Here you go, bro. Oh, you're stressed too, are you? Anybody in this section? She's so stressed you can't catch it. How about this section? I got more. Y'all need one? It's okay. Anybody else? Eric, are you that stressed? Where's Lee Boudreaux? Yeah, she's back there. I know she needs it. You need one too, don't you, Connie? Carol, right? Now, those are for you. The stress balls, you can, maybe that'll help you a little bit, okay? Something else that I want to show you. I've used this 2 times in my life when I was at that point. 2014 was one of them. This is a stress inventory that was created by the American Institute of Stress. Can you believe we have one of those? But it's a really good tool. And it's a test that you take, a little test, you don't pass it or anything. But what they do is they assign life events a point value. For instance, at the top of the list here, it says death of a spouse, 100 points. And then it goes down the list from there. Divorce, 75 points. And so forth. And loss of a job, starting a new job, loss of a loved one. It goes all the way down to, vacations, holidays, minor violations of the law, traffic tickets, stuff like that. Anyway, it gives them point values, and you just go through there, and you take maybe the last 12 to 18 months and see what's been going on in your life, and then you add up the point total. Now, the deal about, and by the way, I have these for you if you want one. They'll be passing these out at the end. I encourage you to take one, find out where you are. But the deal is that if you're over 300 points, it says that there's an 80% chance that you'll get sick within the next year because your immune system will start to shut down. Now, this past week, to make a point, I made our ministry team take this. Okay? So I let them take it, let them add it up. What was the number I used? 300, right? None of them were under 350. I bet you would be just as surprised. But when you discover that, it's a self-discovery tool, then you can start to deal with it. And you start to deal with the physical, you deal with the emotional, and you deal with the spiritual. You have to gear down when you get to this stage. And many of you are at this stage. So I want to encourage you, take that, find out about it. But you don't really need a stress ball. What you really need is a stress call. Make a stress call. Look at Psalm 119, 143. It's there in your notes as well. As pressure and stress bear down on me, David said, I find joy in your commands. What's one of the 10 commandments? Remember the Sabbath day. Remember to rest. Because that's